of the Lantern Group. And so they are, sounds like, fully recovered from the Super Bowl that was just there a couple weeks ago or a week ago. The city's back to normal routine. Kurt and I think some of you that know me know I like to meet new and interesting people, and Kurt is definitely one of those. Had the pleasure of meeting Kurt last year in DC at the Total Rewards Conference. We were just there kind of separately in the hotel lobby bar and struck up the conversation, and I learned about his presentation, which I then viewed. He presented at the World at Work Total Rewards Conference, a session around behavioral science principles, and in particular some work that they did with Eli Lilly. And so he's going to share some updated findings around that today. Kurt's expertise is around behavioral science. So I don't know about you, but for me, this is a topic that's interesting to me, you know, not only from a compensation standpoint, but from an overall day-to-day, anything that we do standpoint. So I'm really privileged to introduce Kurt. This last comment is the lines are muted. So please, if you have a question, we encourage use the chat feature on the webinar. If you're not on the webinar, please see the email that was sent to you upon registration and get on that. Otherwise, we will, if you're phone only for any reason, we will open up the muted lines at the end for questions. So with that, Kurt, again, welcome, and I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Don. Appreciate it. And thank you for having me here. This is a wonderful opportunity, and excited to share some of the findings from what we did at Lilly with you. And so, as you mentioned, we met at World at Work Total Rewards Conference last May, and I gave a similar presentation to this along with James Brewer, who was the Director of Incentive Compensation for Eli Lilly. And so we co-presented this presentation. It was one of the highest rated sessions that they had at the conference. And so today we'll get to see if it was James or if it was actually the session itself. Because if it was James, then you guys, I apologize in advance as we go forward here. So this is going to be broken up into 3 sections. And so the first section, we're going to talk a little bit about the background and history, what was going on at Eli Lilly at the time, why they were looking for a change. Then we'll go into how we did the change. So we'll talk about the process that we used, some of the different outcomes from that and what that entailed. And then the final section is really looking at the behavioral science behind that. So understanding what are those components within the behavioral science piece that are driving the changes that we made and why we did some of those. So that's the component that we're going to be having, and we'll move forward as we do so. So, Carletta, I don't know if I have control still.
You do.
I do. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. All right. So back in 2010, actually before I started working with Eli Lilly, they were going through a component around change. They were changing the way they were going to market. They were looking at the pharmaceutical landscape and saying, hey, we as an organization need to change how we approach our business. It can't be the same way that we have done it in the past. And so they went through and they did a number of changes. And so one of those big pieces that they looked at in this is changing how they were thinking about the business. They had been a product-based company, right? They focused in on all the different drugs that they did, and they talked about the product and the features and benefits of it, the efficacy of their products versus the competition, safety, all of those features. They decided they needed to take a different tone and really go in and be a more customer focused, really looking at this and understanding the customer. They did some marketing and segmentation of the customers, the doctors, and different pieces of that. They looked at the patient. They did a whole new sales training. they came in with a whole new customer satisfaction measure that they were using as part of their overall piece. And senior leadership had a significant focus on that customer satisfaction measure, as well as a number of other things surrounding the customer focus. And so they were really pushing that as an organization, as part of the organizational strategy. They also brought in this component that they called the service value chain. It was an offshoot of the service profit chain that they did. And they used that as a way of looking at their business. How are they driving employee wellness? How are they driving, customer satisfaction, going back into that customer component, ultimately leading into profit or value for both the customer and for Eli Lilly as that. And so they use that model as this framework for how they are putting together a number of initiatives, a number of programs, and even from their performance management perspective, they were looking at the service value chain as how they rated their performance management. And then on the last one here, this we is greater than me, they switched to a team-based focus. They looked out at the landscape and they said, physicians now are working in a much more integrated environment, and as an individual salesperson or even as an individual contributor inside the organization, what they're saying is that we work better as a team together than we do individually. And so there was a big focus in on that. So that was a pretty radical shift for them, given where they were. And so with that, I came into the scene about 2011, 2012, and was working with James Brewer, as I mentioned, the director of incentive comp. And so as he started talking about this, we were looking at this and we realized the organization had changed and their strategy had significantly changed, but their reward and recognition system had not. They were still using the same reward and recognition system, programs, process that they had done for the past 12 years. I think they had put it in 2001, so actually 10 years at that point. And so that had not changed. So their reward and recognition system did not align with the new strategy. And so in those conversations, they realized that they really needed to change the reward and recognition system. And one of the interesting things about this is that they wanted to change that, not just so that it aligned with the strategy that they were doing, but they wanted to use the latest behavioral science to help drive that process. And they did this, and some of the leadership team had read Dan Pink's Drive and had kind of become enamored with that book. And so for people who don't know, Dan Pink had written a book called Drive. If you're in compensation, you probably heard of it. It basically talked, a couple of different factors that, hey, compensation and pay, once those table stakes are set, then you can motivate people through these other three areas. I give Dan Pink credit because he raised the awareness within organizations that there are other motivators besides just having your compensation and pay. But one of the things that we then brought back into them is saying, you know what, that is still important, and it is one of the pieces that is really a vital aspect of this holistic approach to looking at your compensation plans, your reward programs, your recognition systems, all of those things, and they all need to work together in order to pull this through. So with that, around 2012, we started working with them on redesigning their reward and recognition program. And we started with a very simple component where we are doing what we called a behavioral audit. And we did it very specifically around behaviors, because what we wanted to understand was we wanted to look at all of the current programs, processes, incentives, et cetera, that they had in place, and understand what were the behaviors that they were driving. And so we asked 4 questions, and we came up, we had 22 different programs, everything from their quarterly incentive compensation plan to their annual President's Council, their President's Club program, to a district team award and trip, to a variety of other things, all the way down into their fleet car, as various different ways of looking at what are the different touch points that could be considered motivational or an incentive or some type of reward. And as we did that, we put together a big list of all of those potential areas, and we asked 4 questions. What was the strategic intent? So in other words, when this program was put in place, what was the strategic intent of this program? How did that align to the strategy? What were they trying to achieve? And what was the motivation that way they were trying to get out of this? Then we looked at how did it actually impact motivation? So how is it currently working from a motivational perspective? And then how was behavior impacted with that? And finally, we looked at the cost of that program. And so Lilly had about $146 million in incentive compensation and reward and recognition as they were moving forward through this. And so when we did that, we looked at this, then all those answers through a lens. And that lens is called the 4-drive model of employee motivation. It was developed by a couple Harvard business professors, and it was developed out in 2002. So it's a relatively new motivational model. And basically, what this model talks to is, oops, sorry, there we go, is it says there are 4 key components around driving motivation, and so within an employee base. And if you look here, they're an A, B, C, and D kind of thing, so it's an easy model to remember. And there's this first one, which is acquire and achieve. We are all driven to acquire things, status, resources, a variety of different things. This is that incentive pay. This is your compensation. This is the lever that most organizations use on a regular basis. And the second one is bond and belong. So once you start getting away from your pay component, you're looking at what are some of the other drivers of motivation for humans, for employees that are human beings. And one of those is the sense of belonging, a sense of bonding with your coworkers, with your manager, with your customers. And we're driven to create a positive relationship, to engage and to fit in. And then the third one is create and challenge. And again, as individuals, as humans, we're driven to create and improve, to master, to learn and overcome challenges, a variety of different things. And so, again, it's another lever that can be pulled by an organization. And then the last one is the one that's a little bit harder for people, I think, to typically grasp. It's defend and define. And so Lawrence and Noria put it in the way that we used to be tribal. So we used to be in tribes. And we would defend the tribe from outward threats. Well, we don't live in tribes anymore. We have families, we have community organizations, religious church service organizations that we belong to that might make up for that. But work is one of those main substitutes for the tribe. So if you feel an affinity towards the organization or the team that you're working on, you are going to be motivated to defend that from outward threats, and particularly if that is aligned with your definition of who you are. So your goals, your purpose, various different pieces around that. And so we took this 4-drive model, and we took that model and we applied it to that behavioral audit. So we looked at what are each of those different components that we had within there, the incentive plan, the president's council, the variety of different things. And we looked at that and said, what are you, what are they achieving, or what are they satisfying? And what we found out, not surprisingly, was that most, if not all, of the programs that Lilly had in place focused on the drive to acquire and achieve. If you looked at all of those, that it was that focused, or the drive to acquire and achieve, which was the one that was satisfied most. Now, what was also interesting is with Lilly's new focus on we is greater than me, some of the actual programs that they had in place were inhibiting the drive to bond and belong, and actually inhibiting a patient or customer focus. So they had some stack ranking. They had a variety of individual awards where they were competing against their co-workers. And so in those instances, that top person won, but it created a kind of dynamic within the organization that I'm not going to share best practices. I'm not going to work with you, because if I do, that will put you in a better position than me, and I might lose out on an award. Now, people still did that, and they did it because as humans, we have that bond and belong, but the programs and systems that Lilly had in place were actually inhibiting that drive. We also looked at this from a perspective of some behavioral principles, and we'll talk about some of these behavioral principles later. But we saw that they weren't leveraging some of these inherent kind of human factors, where goal gradient theory or idiosyncratic fit or hedonic motivation, and they weren't necessarily leveraging those. And they also weren't leveraging things from a communication perspective. So how they communicated out their rewards and recognition, they weren't tapping into some of those. So what we ended up doing is we ended up putting together a reward and recognition framework that significantly simplified. So we had talked about, or they had 22 different components in their reward and recognition system. We actually broke that down into 4 main big components, and then we had multiple pieces underneath each of those. But when you looked at it, it was a much more simplified approach. We tried to leverage some of the other motivational drives, so beyond just acquire and achieve. And we also looked at how do you make sure that each of these pieces is leveraging off of the other. So when we look at this, we kind of take this approach where we had 4 main components on here. And those main components were the incentive compensation plan. So that quarterly incentive plan that they had, right? And if you look at the little icons on the side, the incentive compensation plan, the way that we built it, obviously it still touched on this acquire and achieve, which is the little dollar sign. But we also worked it, and I'll talk a little bit about this, so that it changed so that it was team focused, and so it actually helped in facilitating some of the bond and belong. And then it also, we had some challenge components that were in it. They were always in it. There was a goal-based plan, and so you still had that challenge component. But we did add in some elements of above and beyond pieces in order to actually enhance that challenge component within there. If you look at trips, again, they had 2 main trips. They had their president's council, which was their top 2% of employee or salespeople, and then they also had their they had what they called achievement trips or district trips. And so again, if you as a team or a district achieved a certain specific district goal, you got to go on a trip. And so we revamped those trips to be easier to take, a little bit more luxurious, a little bit more of a hedonic component within them. But when you look at those trips, they actually satisfy all 4 of the drives. You have senior leadership in there. You have that, which brings in some components around that defend piece, because you have an affinity towards the organization. You have a challenge component. You definitely get the bond and belong. Even on that award, the President's Council, you're in with peers, top peers, and you're winning. But on that district trip in particular, you were there with your team and your spouses or guests that they had brought along. And obviously there's a monetary component within that. And then we also looked at some other non-cash and some other recognition. So we looked at their other recognition, their rep of the year, various different pieces, and again, tweaked those so that they were actually either in the way that we communicated them or in the way that they were actually designed, so that they were tapping into these other drives. And don't have time to go into all of these in detail, but just when we looked at the incentive compensation plan. So the incentive compensation plan that we put together for these guys, we separated it out into three things. So if you remember going back when they were changed their component or the strategy for Lilly, they had a customer focus, they had their service value chain, and then they were looking at this we is greater than me component. And so as we designed this, we put the incentive plan as there was a business goal, there was a customer satisfaction goal, and then there was some service value chain components that we did. So we tied it back into that. And we looked at that from the perspective that business goal now became a district level goal. So there were no longer individual business sales goals, but it was team goals. And that addressed some of that we is greater than me component and took out some of those incentives or disincentives to actually feeling bonding and belonging in various different things. We added in a customer measure. And so as part of their incentive plan, there was a customer satisfaction measure that was added in. And then we also put in some MBOs around the service value chain and some of the various different components along that line. And so as we did that, we applied again some of these behavioral science principles into this as we're going forward. So I'm gonna stop there for a second. Are there any questions from people in regards to that setup and various different things? The next part I'm going to talk about is how we applied behavioral science into the design of the incentives and the plans and some of the things that we used, as well as then into the communication part of that.
Hey, Kurt, there is nothing on the line yet. I would encourage, again, the lines are going to stay muted. If anybody could type their comment or question into that chat box. I will, meantime, Kurt, I had a question on the prior slide. If I think I heard you correctly in the upper left box, it sounds to me like in the sales incentive plan that more team-based measures were introduced through this project. And so for me, as somebody that deals with a lot of sales comp, and I'm a little bit of a traditionalist, you know, individual pay for individual performance, you know, that kind of mentality. I wonder, introducing those, and I'm not asking you to be a sales comp guru, but introducing those, was that kind of a, you know, a radical shift for their sales force? And was there any kind of resistance around, hey, we're heading towards socialism here? What did you guys encounter?
You bring up, there were many discussions inside of the organization. And then actually, I'll talk two parts of that because you bring up a really interesting part. There were some of the senior leadership in this. This was a 6 to 7 month process of coming in and looking and exploring. We did a number of field interviews. We talked to people. We did a variety of other things in addition to some of the stuff that I'm talking about here. But within that executive rank, we had two camps. We had the camp that said, no, this is, you know, you take away that individual motivation and all of a sudden you're gonna lose some of our top performers and a variety of different components, and you're gonna move at, I like how you said socialism, because one of the guys said, you know, we're not a communist country or company. You know, we're not a socialist company here. And so we had to work through that. So yes, it was a radical shift for them. And I think what got them there was the purpose again of saying, look, you're changing the way that you're going to market. So you're radically already shifting how you're approaching the business. And if you don't align your reward and recognition program in with that new strategy, what you're really telling people is you're saying what we're saying out of one side of our mouth is not, you know, being the same as what we're telling you with our reward and recognition system. So it was a challenge to get that. I will tell you, when we introduced this, and we told people up front, we said you are going to get a certain percentage of your sales force who are going to be very upset with this, and you might even get some attrition. You are going to have a whole nother set within your sales force that are going to look at this with a breath of fresh air, as a breath of fresh air, and that they are going to be relieved that it is moving this way. And there are a couple other things on so we moved to this district component. They still had some individual measures. So in that service value chain component, there were some individual MBO components where their manager was rating them. So that wasn't fully like you were just a part of this commune. You did have individual ratings. You did have you were still measured individually on your sales and various different things. But the other interesting thing on this is that brought in a component of social pressure, social component of making sure that you are not letting the team down. And going back to that bond and belong component, it's actually an underrated motivator. People talk about there's another behavioral science principle where basically it says once you get the effort that you exert individually, and that happens in certain instances. It happens in instances where your performance can't easily be determined. In other words, other people can't see how much work you're putting into things. And so one of the things that we did very specifically around this is made sure that still individual sales numbers were published, and that they were published, and that the team had those numbers. So if there was somebody who was being lackadaisical or not pulling their weight, the team actually exerted pressure. And we found that after the fact, when we went back a year later, and we went back 3 years later on this, and we looked at those different measures, and that was clearly the case, that there was a strong social pressure to perform. But they did lose. There was a lot of angst around this, both at the executive level and in the sales force measure. So I don't know, Don, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it sure does. It's interesting.
Yeah. And I think it is one of the biggest challenges in other organizations I've worked with where we've tried to implement the same thing. There is always that pushback of, well, how are they going to actually be motivated to perform at their top, or we're not rewarding them for their performance. But in effect, you know, it just is, where are you placing that performance? Different things. One of the things that helped on this too was some of the data issues that if you've ever worked in pharmaceutical, there are some sales data issues about the accuracy of data, and that accuracy gets more accurate the further up that chain you go. So at a district level, the accuracy of their sales data was much improved over the accuracy at a territory level. So that was one of the pieces that we had in our favor that might not necessarily be in the favor of other organizations. So,
right. I mean, without taking us down a deep dive into sales comp design, I mean, you just touched on it right there. The other aspect going through my mind is, you know, clearly the roles must have in some way lended themselves to a team-based selling model, you know, this kind of thing. So no, that's good clarification there. Still no questions on the line. I'd encourage anyone that has them, throw them out there under everyone, or if you send it to a particular person, only that person's going to view. So anyway, so Kurt, we're good to keep going.
All right, all right. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the behavioral science behind this, and so give you some insights into some of the things that we thought about as we're looking at this, and how you can think about using some of these principles in your own incentives or reward programs. So um, one of the pieces, and again, uh, a lot of this is common sense, but sometimes it's common sense in a very interesting way. So perceived fairness is a grounding principle, and it's one I know from incentive compensation. You guys work on this all the time, but people are highly influenced by a sense of fairness. And in reality, it's not the sense of fairness; it's the perceived lack of fairness that is. And I love this quote: "Fairness seems a bit like air. Its absence is a lot more noticeable than its presence." So I always say, look, if you have a fair incentive plan or a fair reward system, it's not going to motivate anybody to go out and do that extra sales call or work that extra hour late into the evening or whatever it is that you're trying to get them to do. That fairness isn't a motivator. But oh my gosh, if you get a perception of unfairness or of a lack of fairness within something, you will see that motivation significantly drop. And there's this really interesting research, and so it's called the ultimatum game. I'm going to go over this real quick and then kind of show you what this is. So again, from a economic perspective, this next research is really interesting because it doesn't make sense from a classical economic perspective. So the ultimatum game, if people who haven't heard it, is two players split $10 or $100 or whatever it would be, but most of them have used a $10 component. And one person makes the offer of the split. So they're given the $10. The one rule is they have to give either a penny, a dollar, $5, or $9.99 to the other person. That other person then can either accept or reject that offer. There is no negotiation. There is no other interaction that they have. They either accept the offer or they reject the offer. The interesting part is if you were a classical economist, if that person offered you a dime, a nickel, a quarter, a penny even, you are better off accepting that offer from a financial and economic perspective than refusing that offer. But the fact of the matter is we're human. And so there's this sense of fairness, and that fairness comes into play. And the research again, and this is across board, whether it's $10, $100, $1,000, is that you need about 30% or more for people to accept it. Now, that doesn't mean that any individual wouldn't accept that penny, but on average, you need to offer $3 to $4 to $5 for people to accept the offer, which again, classical economists would say that doesn't make sense. You're actually hurting yourself in this just to get back or to cause some pain for the other person, but it goes back into the sense of fairness. And I think this is really interesting because I think it goes even deeper than this. And Carletta, this is where we have the video that's going to come on here. But this is an interesting piece. So this is an innate component. And so I don't know if anybody's seen this. Frans de Waal is a researcher, and he's done a lot of research with animals. And he did this research with capuchin monkeys around fairness and unequal pay. And so you'll hear in this where he talks about these monkeys have to do this little they have to give a rock to the researcher, and then they get rewarded with either a cucumber or with a grape. And so go ahead, Carletta, and let's get this, if we can start this. And the volume on this is low, so maybe turn up your volume if you can't hear. I can't hear anything. So anyway, the monkey gives a rock and got a cucumber. Now he sees the other monkey. Other monkey does the job that they're doing, and the other monkey gets a grape. All right. The monkey sees that, goes, okay, there we go. Oh, and the monkey gets a cucumber again. Tries the cucumber. Rose the cucumber is mad. Next monkey goes ahead, does the thing again. It's another grape. Monkey does that.
I can play it again. I'm sorry, my volume was off on my phone. Do we play it again?
That's okay. I think we're good. I think people have understood it here. So
okay.
Just continue.
Okay.
You won't get to hear the audience laughing in the background. This is a TED Talk, but you can look it up. So he tries again, gets a cucumber again, throws it back at the researcher, and is very upset as he's seeing. So again, you can see from this, fairness is one of those factors that comes into play even at the most basic level that we go. So sorry that the sound on that wasn't the greatest, but I think it points to a interesting phenomena around that fairness aspect. And so as you're designing your incentive plans, as you're building any reward and recognition program, that perceived fairness is a significant component. And we use that in again, some of the components that we talked about in that design of how some of the recognition programs were done at Lilly and various different things. The other piece that we brought in to Lilly was hedonic motivation. And so, you know, everybody, we talk about looking at what actually drives performance and motivation. And if you ask people a question of would you prefer cash or an award or a trip, most of the surveys that I've ever seen, it's usually 70 to 80% of people will say cash. And we understand that. It makes, again, full economic sense that you would prefer the cash over the non-cash or the hedonic reward. But in reality, what ends up happening is that the hedonic rewards actually have a greater impact on performance. There, and a couple of reasons for that is you don't get this indulgence guilt. In other words, you got $500 in a bonus check. We have this component where we might justify for ourselves taking $100 of that and using it on some kind of pleasure, but the other $300 to $400 or whatever that would be in our mental accounting would need to go to pay stuff like bills and groceries and various different things. So when you're offered the set of golf clubs or a trip or whatever it is, you don't have that indulgence guilt. You don't have to do a mental accounting and putting them into different buckets. And so again, they have some of that. The other interesting piece is that hedonic luxuries are viewed often as being more valuable than what their actual worth is. And there's, again, some various interesting things like that. So again, in the work that we did with Lilly, we added in a non-cash reward program for them as part of what they were doing. And they were adding in, you know, some components where they had an awards catalog and points and various different things. But we also expanded on that trip and really, from a communications perspective, really tried to emphasize some of the hedonic luxuries, and hedonic being pleasurable, not the hedonism kind of component. It's a actual scientific term that I use, and sometimes people laugh at me. But again, interesting component. So again, don't use this in replace of your cash, but in addition to your cash, hedonic luxuries can really drive motivation. So as you're thinking about your reward and recognition programs, how are you ancillarily adding in these components that are going to drive a lot more motivation for an award or some sort of luxury than a simple cash or gift card for that same thing. Idiosyncratic fit is another interesting piece. And again, this is just this component where if we feel, and the important part is feel that we have a unique advantage in a program, or that a program is tailored specifically for us, it creates a greater sense of motivation. Ron Kivitz is a researcher, Case Western, and he did a really interesting thing where it was about joining a credit card program. And if you looked at this, there was, you earn some points with the credit card, right? And so he had a couple different situations. He had a credit card where there was a low cost entry fee, and then in other words, you only had to, is either free or you paid minimum amount to get the credit card. And there was another one where you got the credit card and you had a high cost of entry. And so he did an experiment, and he had one case where the points that you earned on this doubled for all grocery stores or gas chains, and it follows a typical turn, right? More people are likely to join that credit card program at the lower cost and less on the high. But what was interesting is he had double your points at your grocery. So you actually pick a specific grocery store or gas chain. So it's actually less lucrative than the all one. And people were more likely to join the credit card program. And it was even more interesting is that they were much more likely when there was a high cost of entry. And when he paired this back, again, economically, this doesn't make sense. But when you tear it back and you looked at the human emotion side of things, the behavioral science side of this, what you find is that when you think about something that it's tailored, because you felt that it's tailored to you and that the higher cost point, it's more exclusive, it feels like this is a much more tailored program to who you are. And so you get that. So again, the more that you can tailor your specific programs to an individual, even if they're perceived in that way, is a really interesting piece. One last piece here is goal gradient theory. And goal gradient theory just says the closer you get to your target or your goal, the more likely or the more motivation that you have. But there's also this component where there's an illusionary goal progress. And again, Ron Kivitz did this research. Get people with coffee card, right? You buy 10, get one free. And then he did another one. Sorry about this here, the builds. Buy 12, get one free, but 2 of them were pre-punched. So in other words, they still had 10 coffees to buy. And if you look at this, the average to get the 10 free was 15.6 days versus 12.7. It was like a 37% improvement on how quickly people filled this card. The actual effort that was required was exactly the same, but it was the perception of moving closer to the goal, that you already have a fast start and that you're moving forward. So once again, these principles are there. So when we designed some of the reward programs, we talked about how far they had already come. We talked about various different pieces. And so again, it's part of this as we're going forward here. So with that, I'm gonna stop there and see if there are any questions. I do have some behavioral economic principles on communication that we can talk to, but I want to see if there's any questions around any of these behavioral science principles before we move on.
So again, please use the chat feature. We've got everybody muted until we get to the end. One question that I have while we're waiting for that, Kurt, would be, take these last 2 slides that you just showed us, and can you give us an example of within perhaps the Eli Lilly project, or perhaps within a compensation scheme, right? So this is coffee punch cards. In terms of employee compensation, I'm sort of thinking about, and correct me, but you know, I have an incentive target. So if my incentive target is harder, but I give credit up front to make it seem like it's maybe not as hard, it's the same as if the target were less and I didn't have any. Can you give us some examples of what you guys ran into with Lilly?
Yeah, and so one of the interesting things we did on there was actually a short-term contest, and we used this goal gradient component, right? They had to achieve, and I forget what it was. Actually, we used both of them because it was a subset of individuals, of physicians that they got to target. So they got to choose, so that idiosyncratic fit allowed them to choose the 20 targets that they were working on. And then they had to grow volume X%. But what was interesting is they gave them a bonus, and they said, but we're actually already crediting you with some, kind of like basically giving them 2 free punches. And they said, we're actually crediting you from the month before. The dynamics of it aren't really necessary to go into, But what they did is they basically said, you already started on this. So you're already, look, your goal is, say it's 100, you're already at 20, even though they hadn't done anything up until that point. And so again, they were able to really ramp and do a fast start on this. The other piece on this that's really important to think about is it gets into communication. And so how do you communicate this information? Do you communicate, hey, look at what you've already done, and achieve as you're starting through your, even if it's your quarterly incentive program or an annual incentive program, is how are you communicating that information as it gets out? So how people are doing. One of the things that we've seen other organizations do is customize and tailor those messages that you get based upon putting people into certain buckets of performance. So if it's a goal-based incentive plan, you know, if you are at 60% or below the goal, you get a message. If you're 60 to 70, you get a separate message. 70 to 80, a separate message. And you can do that based on, you know, when you roll out your reports and various different things. And we've seen people do that, and we've helped organizations in implementing that. But again, that ties into some of that idiosyncratic fit, because you're going, this is tailored specifically for me. And that messaging is coming specifically based on where I am and what I need to do given my specific situation. And so you have that more customized perspective. So.
Great. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So perhaps we can finish the remaining slides, and I suspect that folks on the line will appreciate us when we do unmute the lines, and then we can ask questions directly.
All right. I will go quickly in here, but again, this is around the communication. So one of the big things that we really focused in with Lily on was making sure that they were communicating their incentives and their rewards in a manner that was actually going to drive behavior. And it wasn't just about informing them. It was about making sure they understood, obviously, but also about making sure that the way that we were communicating was driving action. And so one of the big things on this from a behavioral science principle is how you frame something. Do you frame something as a loss? Do you frame it as a gain? Do you frame something from a certain perspective or from an uncertain perspective? And again, an interesting research on this was there was a Ph.D. program that said, hey, if you sign up for the next year's courses before August 1st, we'll give you a discount. They sent that message out to half of the group. They sent out another message to the other half of the group. Hey, if you don't sign up by August 1st, you'll have a penalty for signing up or registering after. And so if you look at the actual percentage, we had 93% of people register before the August 1st deadline when it was framed as a penalty. When it was framed as a discount, it was 67%. And again, that gets into some of the component. There's loss avoidance and various different motivational factors in there, but just it was exactly the same component. There was the same percentage discount or penalty that they had. I mean, people weren't paying anything different. It was just the way that it was framed. So again, from an incentive or a reward perspective, understand how your communications are being framed, because that framing can have a drastic impact on how people perceive it and thus the action that they take from it. I will tell you that this loss component, sometimes you can use that in incentive, and just from the perspective of saying, don't leave money on the table, right? And because now you're framing this as leaving money on the table around your 2018 incentives, as opposed to look at how much you can earn. And it frames the conversation in a very different manner. And so there's simple little tricks about how you communicate like that that can have a significant impact on the back end. Social proof. This is another very powerful motivator, and it goes back into some of that bond and belong drive that we talked of differently. But if you've ever been in a hotel room where they say, hey, you know, 70% of the people in this room hang their towels up so they're not being cleaned and not wasting energy. You've seen this in play. But basically what this is that people are more likely to do what other people are doing, particularly when they're unsure of the right answer or it's an uncertain situation. And so one of the interesting things is Solomon Asch had done some research way back in the 50s about conformity and various different things. And basically he had a group of 10 people or 8 people in a room. Unbeknownst, there was only one person who was actually a research subject. The others were all conspirators. They were all part of the experiment. You might have read this when you're in your Psych 101. But they would go around the room, and when people said the right one, they put a test line up there, and then they had 3 test lines that they showed up on the wall and said, which one matches that line? And if people went around and various different things, almost 100% of the time, people got it right. But in one situation, they didn't. And that situation is when they were 7th or 8th to choose, and the 6 or 7 people before them all chose the wrong one. In that case, 75% of the people conformed. In other words, they agreed. So if in this instance, if you were the last person to state which line it was, if everybody before you had said A, you're more likely to say A. 3/4 of the time, people would say A, even though they look at it and they go, oh, it really looks like C to me, but maybe I'm seeing something wrong. So again, you use this from a perspective of talking about bringing in that social proof into your incentives about how many people are performing, how people are doing, a variety of different things, best practices, and bringing in those personal testimonials. Cognitive overload, I'll go real quick again. We can only comprehend so much information at one point, and at a certain time, our brains get full, is basically the easiest way to say it, and we stop processing. And so the way that you communicate information, you can communicate the same amount of information, but if you do it in a much simpler, easier to comprehend or easier to understand way, you have a much better chance of capturing that. So those are the principles that we talk to. And so if there's any questions, be happy to take that. If you want to open up the lines, I think we're good.
Yeah, thanks. And Carletta, if you can unmute the lines.
All right, so if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I know I kind of talked a lot there. I apologize, but hopefully the information was valuable. Again, a lot of this is nuances, but I think a lot of it can be really impactful as you're thinking about your own reward systems, your own incentives. So
we'll use a behavioral science aspect to get somebody to ask a question. You will be leaving money on the table if you're not the first one to ask a question.
Oh. All right. Well, I know we're running close to time, so maybe people are looking at this and saying, all right, I need to get to my next one. So with that, Don, unless there are questions, I'd be happy to answer. And here's my email. If anybody wants to email me a question, I'd be happy to answer one-on-one or set up a time to talk through. I do geek out about this, and spend a lot of my free time on doing different ways of educating people on behavioral science and various different things. So be happy to share that with anybody at any time.
Thank you, Kurt. And thanks to everyone on the call. We will make the slides available online. We've got a couple of events coming up for CCA. There's a World of Work training, and as well an update on corporate tax reform next month. So watch your emails and look for, again, thanks again, Kurt. This has been fantastic. I love the video. I shared the video on the chat as well for anybody to watch that afterwards. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Don. Thanks, everyone.
Good. Bye.
Bye.